Welcome to this screencast on developing with the Microsoft Graph. Let me first talk a little bit about what this screencast is and what you can expect from it before we start diving into the content. This screencast is going to accompany a hands-on lab and a training module that you can take advantage of that goes along with everything you're going to find in this screencast. Specifically, you're going to find in this screencast is really going to be an example of someone presenting the content from the training module as a way for you to learn how you could use this module and delivering it to a different user group or at a conference. However, you can also use it as self-paced learning. Now, the way that this module is set up is that it's broken up into a series of a couple different sections. We'll go through each one of them in just a few minutes. Each one of these sections is going to finish with a demonstration. Now, the demonstration, we don't walk through the entire step of creating the application or walking through the steps of writing all the code. Instead, we look at the final solution that has already been built and kind of pick through the code and pick through the important parts that you should take advantage of or you need to take note of. And we'll see it working as well. If you want to go through and you want to build the application, you want to see how it's being built, then what we would recommend that you do is go check out the hands-on lab that accompanies this module. Because the hands-on lab, each of the exercises maps to one of the demos inside of this screencast that you're going to see. So if you want to see how to build it and you want to walk through the steps, you can walk through the hands-on lab exercise that accompanies this module and get to the exact same place that we're showing you here in the screencast. Instead, we're not going to show in the screencast all the individual steps of creating the application. And part of that is because things change on a rapid cadence, and the lab is going to have the most updated steps and dependencies and stuff that you're going to need. The screencast is more or less showing you how the thing works or how the final solution works. So that's how you can learn more about taking advantage of this content and how we've structured this. Let's go ahead and dive into the actual module itself. In this module, we're going to look at how to build Android native apps with the Microsoft Graph Java SDK. In this first section, we're going to do an introduction to the Microsoft Graph API, a little bit of getting started content, and then we're going to talk about Android and how to develop for Android applications. And then we're going to talk about building an Android application for Azure AD and Microsoft Graph. This module has a couple different sections associated with it. The first section is more introductory. The second section is going to be about the authentication piece in more depth. And then the third piece is going to be more about integrating the Microsoft Graph in an Android application. Office 365 Developer Vision focuses on the user's experience and their data. And as a developer, you can bring your application into the user experience. With over 1.2 billion users of Office worldwide, this is a huge opportunity to provide a window into your application, as well as being able to connect into their data and add intelligence to your application. There are currently over 850 million events created each month and a total of over 400 petabytes of data stored in the service that can add value for your users. The Microsoft Graph is the gateway to your data in the Microsoft Cloud. As you see there from the bottom of the list, we've got a lot of different services and data types that we can actually take advantage of from Office 365 and Microsoft. And it's all considered part of the Microsoft 365 platform. We can work with mail and calendar, contacts, tasks. We can work with content inside of SharePoint sites and lists, files inside of OneDrive, things inside of Microsoft Teams, users inside of Azure Active Directory. There's so many different things that we can take advantage of. The nice thing here is that each one of these different services usually has its own API where we can talk to these different services to get the data out. It can be challenging to go get the data from all these individual services as they each have their own endpoints, they may have their own permissions, and that also means that with their different access control that we have and talking to these different services using an OAuth style authentication via Azure Active Directory, that means that each one of these different endpoints is going to have to require their own access token. One of the nice things about the service called the Microsoft Graph is that the Microsoft Graph is going to serve as a proxy endpoint to all of these other different services. It's going to encompass things such as Office 365, Windows 10, and Enterprise Mobility and Security. And it brings all of these different services under one top-level service called graph.microsoft.com. The advantage to using the Microsoft Graph is that it's going to allow you to just have a single point resource, which means you're only going to need a single access token to be able to talk to all of these different services. They still have their own individual permissions, or as we refer to them as scopes, so that everything is still secured in a very individual way. But this makes it easier for developers to build applications. All Office 365 cloud services, including SharePoint Online and the Microsoft Graph, leverage Azure AD for authentication and authorization. This means there's a single authentication flow that you can use inside of your Office 365 applications, as well as those created to leverage the Microsoft Graph. This single authentication flow means that we're just going to have one way that we have to log in to all of these different services and obtain an access token, either using a web application or a native application. It also has a whole consent model. We'll look at that a little bit more in a future section. Everything is also very secure. Everything is based off the OAuth 2 protocol, which means that the application that you build is never going to collect user credentials. We're always going to redirect them over to Azure AD, have the users log in, and then Azure AD will provide my application that I can build as a developer with a special code that the application can then use to exchange for an access token to be able to call these different endpoints and services, such as the Microsoft Graph, on behalf of these different users. We also have some very fine-grained permissions, otherwise known as scopes, so that users can only grant the application specific permissions of different things that they want to allow the application to do. And then we can also have some special considerations that we have to take into account if we're building native applications. So there's some things like when you build a web application, you have a client ID and secret. You can protect the secret because there's server-side code that the web application doesn't have to expose to the end users. But as we'll talk about a little bit later, the native applications do have a little bit of a challenge where once the code has been distributed, we can't include both the client ID and the secret, because if we distribute the secret, well, technically it's no longer a secret anymore. We'll see how this works in a native application in just a little bit. Now, Office 365 has a single authentication flow for Office 365 and the Microsoft Graph. Users are going to sign in using a technology called OpenID Connect, which is an open standard. And what that does is that once people have logged in, there's this nice little envelope wrapper that will include details about the individual who's just logged in. Azure AD is going to be used for all of the authentication. The Microsoft Graph is built on top of the authentication model of Azure AD. Office 365 is also built on top of the authentication model of Azure AD. So both of these services trust Azure AD. By having this single level of trust or single service that they both trust, then we can leverage the authentication to take advantage of both of these different services with the same authentication flow. This authentication flow is also going to support multi-factor authentication, also referred to as MFA, and federated user sign-ons. And it's going to support all different kinds of applications, from device applications such as those on a mobile device, websites, single-page applications that live 100% in the client, or as a headless application with no user involvement, also referred to as a daemon or as a service-based application. You'll be able to pin applications to your Office 365 app launcher from the My Apps page, which is like that little menu that you have in the top left corner within Office 365. Now, let me talk a little bit about working with Android and Android development. The Microsoft Graph provides a Java SDK that you're going to use with Android-based development. Developers can leverage either the Azure Active Directory Authentication Library, which is used for the Azure AD v1 endpoint, or the Microsoft Authentication Library, which is referred to as the MSAL, which is good with the Azure AD v2 endpoint. Now we're going to see the differences of these in the next section when we talk more about authentication and security in Azure AD. But for now, we're just going to leave it at that just from the high level. You can use either ADAL or MSAL inside of your application. The Microsoft Graph does recommend, though, that you use the v2 endpoint, which means you're going to be using the Microsoft Authentication Library. But again, we'll get to that in a little bit. So what does the development story look like when you're building Android apps? Well, there's always lots of different ways you can do things, but the way that we're going to focus on it inside of this screencast and in this module is probably the most standard way of doing it. Developers are going to use something called Android Studio, which is a free IDE implementation on top of the IntelliJ platform that's provided by the Android development team. All application registration is going to be done using using the Azure AD admin portal. So you're going to create your application, that's the code, and then you're going to register a logical application with Azure AD, and that's how your application is going to be able to identify itself with Azure AD, how users are going to be able to grant your application permissions to act on their behalf and to talk to the Microsoft Graph on their behalf. You're also going to be using a tool called Gradle. And what Gradle is it's a package management and a build tool that is commonly used in Android development. If you're familiar with .NET development, this is very similar to MS Build and NuGet in a .NET project, where we use MS Build for a lot of our build tasks, and we use NuGet for package acquisition and management. Now, you need to think a little bit when you're building a native application, when you should consider doing native Android development. Because you have a couple different options on how to do this. Well, native mobile development is really going to come into play when you have device-specific capabilities you want to take advantage of. And these are things that are very specific to the mobile device or the tablet that you're working on, that you need native SDKs to do that work. Or if you're doing some complex or advanced user experiences or visualizations and you don't want to go with a more abstract kind of model, you could always look to use a cross-platform option, such as something like Xamarin or Cordova. They have their own advantages and disadvantages, but that is an abstraction layer that is not going to be native to the device that you're working on. And so you do lose a little bit of low-level control, but you do gain from the developer productivity, where you can just still use the exact same languages that you're used to working with. Like in the case of Xamarin, you're still working with .NET, you're still working with common controls that you're used to working with, but they are cross-platform, meaning that they're going to work both on a native experience inside, say, an Android device or an iOS device or a Windows device. And because they're common across all of them, some things kind of have to be dumbed down a little bit, which means you don't get the low-level access to the actual device controls themselves. Now, let's look a little bit about creating an Android native Java application for Android, and let's see what's involved with this. So what you're going to do is you're going to first create the application. You're going to write the code using Android Studio to go build the application. Now, the way I would recommend you do this is to implement the user experience and really have like a functioning prototype that's just a click through. It doesn't have any logic in it. It doesn't do any authentication or anything like that, but it just focuses on giving you an experience of, I've got the application up and running. Then the next step you're going to want to do is handle authentication. So I would extend the app to support authentication and acquiring a token, an access token from Azure AD. And you're going to use that to talk to the Microsoft Graph. And then that's the last step, is to integrate the Microsoft Graph Java SDK into your application to get information back out of the application. So what does that story look like? Well, here's just a little screenshots of kind of what you would see. First, you're going to create the application using Android Studio. That's a native app that's going to be running on your desktop. Then you're going to implement the user experience. And so here you can see all I've done is done a really simple user experience that has a sign-in button. And then you're going to test the application prior to implementing your authentication and the Azure AD and the MSAL library and integrating the Microsoft Graph. And so here, once I click sign on, it assumed that I was signed on. So it showed a button about getting events, and it even shows a little toast notification at the bottom that says, hello, you're welcome to signing in. Now, let's see how to go about doing this. Now, what we've got here is a demo that we're going to look at, which is the built solution of a sample Android application. This Android application doesn't do anything special other than it just provides a little click-through of what the application would look like if it was up and running. So I don't have any Azure AD authentication set up in here. There's no authentication piece to it. There is also no calls that are going to be calling the Microsoft Graph. We've just kept the bare bones minimum stuff in here just to make this application work. And we're going to walk through the code and kind of see what this experience looks like, just so you can get familiar with this. Again, just like all the other demos that we have in this screencast and other graph-related development screencast that we have in other these training modules. If you want to see the step-by-step process and walk through this yourself, go check out the hands-on lab exercises that accompanies this screencast that's in the module that accompanies the screencast if you want to go through and do that yourself. Okay, as I said previously, that in this demo, we're going to look at a pre-built application that I've already gone through and followed all the steps that we have in our hands-on lab to create this application. It's an Android-based application that is really just a click-through wireframe. So let me show you some of the stuff that I did. I went through and I created a brand new project. And one of the first things that we did is I came over here to the build.gradle section. And I added in this section that you see right here, which says Android support design 28. And this is allowing me to do certain kind of navigation elements for my application. It allows me to do what's called like a drawer, or navigation drawer layouts, making them available to my application. So this is one thing that I ended up doing. Another thing that we ended up doing here is this packaging options thing. This is just another kind of a setup thing that we wanted to end up implementing here. So one of the things, if I come over here and I look at the res folder in the drawable section, what I've got is a couple different things that I've set up. So you see I have this home vector that I have here for one menu item. I have a calendar option, I have a sign in option, and I have a sign out option as well that I've created for each one of these different elements. And then one of the other things that we did is I went over here and I created this new menu folder, and I have this drawer menu. And so what this is kind of what my navigation is going to look like. And it's using those different elements that I just created from the drawable section. So there's home, there's calendar, sign in, and sign out. And so that's the little drawer menu that I had defined that you see right here. I then went into the styles folder that you'll find over here under value and styles. And I defined a couple different colors that I wanted to end up using here. But specifically, I added in these things here. So the window action bar, I have that set to false. I have no title on the window. And then I also have on the status bar color, I also define this as transparent. Now, back over here to my layout, one of the things I did is I created a nav header. So this is my nav header, and this is what the application looks like. So I have this header up here at the top. When I build my application, and I've defined it all using this XML. So I have like an image that's been set up, text view, another text view that just have some text right here for an email address and a test user. So that's all stuff that's going to get replaced a little bit later. Now, the main activity here that you see, this is my main application. And so here what you see here that I've got is there's my navigation menu that was defined using the nav header. So that's where this whole menu is set up over here, where I've got my drawer set up and I've got the main navigation set up. And then I've also got everything else set up behind the scenes here with this relative layout using a toolbar, having a progress bar, and a frame layout. And that's all like the main structure of how my application is going to be set up. Then I also went and added some localization stuff here where I have some other references in my application. So in the strings, I set some things to this, like there's the graph tutorials, the name of my application, the open and the close for the drawer. I put some, don't want to do that. Went through and set those different strings that you see here. Now, the last thing I had to do, or the main thing I had to do here, is I had to set up my application. If I look at the main activity, I had to then go build the application itself that was going to do all of the logic here. So what does this do? So I've got a lot of import statements that you see up here at the very top. And then I've got my main activity. This is like the main thing that's going to run when my application runs. So when the application is actually being created, you can see here I'm setting the content view equal to the resource layout called activity main. We saw what that was defined a little bit earlier. I set the toolbar, and I set up the little menu piece that you see there on the top right-hand corner. And then I'm also setting the current user's name. And then I'm also going to set the navigation element and the home fragment. And the home fragment, these different fragments are the different ways you're able to see how things are defined, like the way that the UI is going to be kind of laid out here. So that's when things get created. And then here's what happens when I call the home fragment. I'm passing in a username that you see right here, defining an instance of it, and then I'm simply going to be setting it to the navigation element of where I want this to be displayed. And then there's a couple other elements here. I've got the open calendar fragment, these sign in and sign out buttons, which really don't do anything today. And then I have this other section here on navigation items selected. So this is just watching for the different elements that are selected in my navigation and doing different things like opening different fragments that we're going to be defined. So signing in, signing out, or opening the calendar fragment, or opening up the home fragment if I go back home. All right. A couple of things that have been set up here, like the progress bar, hiding and showing it, and then the setting of the state of what's going on with this. So now one thing I want you to notice though is I've gone ahead and I've set up for just my demo purpose here is I've set up a hard-coded thing to where the person that's signing in is Megan Brown. So when I run the application, that it's going to show that I'm logged in as Megan Brown. But remember, I don't have any authentication stuff that's been defined just yet. Then I've gone through and I've defined my different fragments. So I come over here and I've created a fragment. Over here is my fragment home. If I go to the layout, fragment home. So here's the home fragment looks like. So I've just got welcome, please sign in. So there's my text view and another text view listed right here. And then I have another fragment for my calendar. So this is where I'm going to list out all the different items. And right here, there's really nothing to show. We're going to deal with this in a later module. Now, if I come over here to my my home fragment code that you see listed here. Now, what am I doing with this home fragment here? What this is the code that's going to run, kind of like the code behind for the actual UI that I just defined. So what happens when it's when a new instance is created, when it's on create fires, when it's on view fires, or on creating the view fires. All this stuff is pretty static right now. It's not really doing anything all that special, other than it's taking in the username when the thing is actually created, and I'm setting the username to a specific property on the application. And as far as the calendar fragment goes too, kind of the same thing. It's just some bare bones code here that we see that I have all set up with this. Okay, so let's test our application and see if everything works. So I'm going to come over here and just click the play button. It's going to fire up an emulator. And here's our emulator right here. Now I'm going to have to try and move the screen around a bit to make sure we can see everything. So here you can see welcome to sign in. So there's our application. I come over here and click on this. You can see that please sign in. So I'll click on sign in. And I can see I'm already signed in as Megan Bowen, and we can see how the sign out button is kicked in, and I see Megan Bowen's information. So we can see the basics of this application up and running. It's not a very full-fledged application just yet, but that's because we need to go through and start adding all of the extra code for doing authentication with Azure AD, and also setting up everything that we need for getting our application to work with the Microsoft Graph. So we're going to see that in future demos. But in this demo, I just wanted you to see a little tour of the project that we've built and to see it up and running. In this second section of this module, we're going to focus on the authentication piece and how we can deal with authentication inside of a native application, specifically a native Android application. We're going to look at the authentication overview, talk a little bit about Azure AD, the application registration portal, or the Azure AD admin portal, and then how we can implement the Microsoft authentication library in Android-based applications. Before we do that, let's talk a little bit about Azure AD, OAuth, and Microsoft 365. Again, as we talked about in the previous section, both Office 365 and the Microsoft Graph both leverage Azure AD for their authentication model. And what's nice about this is that once a user is logged in, they don't have to log in twice. They're logged in once. They're going to be able to use the Microsoft Graph to talk to all of their Office 365 application. This provides us a single authentication flow that is available on all Office 365 services and a lot of other Microsoft 365 services as well. Native applications can be leveraged using this authentication model, which is what we're doing in this module, but we can also build websites, services, daemons, etc. There are two different types of consents that we're going to have to also implement as well. And the way this works is that in the different consent, we'll talk more about the details about what static and dynamic consent is in a little bit. But you also have two other types of consent, which is end user consent and admin consent. End user consent is me as a user granting an application access to my calendar to act on my behalf. So that is only me working with this application and granting it access to use my calendar or the data in my calendar. That's end user consent. admin consent is something that's much more far-reaching and should be used sparingly, actually. Admin consent is for certain permissions where an organization wants to give an application access to all users' calendar or all users' contacts or all files, stuff like that, or all groups within the tenant. That's something that the global tenant administrator is going to have to do. You won't be able to do that as an individual user. Azure AD OAuth is also a very secure protocol. And I talked about this in the last section. But the big thing here to take note of is that the OAuth 2 protocol does not allow the application, or it doesn't encourage the application to collect user credentials to be able to log into some other service like the Microsoft Graph or Azure AD. Instead, what we're going to do, and you'll see this in the demo, is that instead we are going to code up our application to send the user somewhere else to go log in, which is Azure AD. They're going to do that by popping up a browser on the device. And then it's going to give control back to Azure AD is going to give control back to the application and provide it with a code that was signed by Azure AD. The application can then use that code to go back to Azure AD and say, this code is something that you provided the user, and I need to get an access token on behalf of this user. And that code contains all the information that Azure AD needs to provide that token. This process also supports very fine-grained access scopes. We refer to access scopes also as permissions. It also supports different types of authentication, such as multi-factor auth and federated user sign-ins. And these tokens are only going to be valid for a very limited amount of time. But for user consent, we will also allow us to have refresh tokens where we can ask, our application can ask without user involvement for an updated token that they could use. Now, we do have some special considerations when it comes to native applications on a mobile device. These things are inherently multi-tenant, and we also have the challenge of dealing with an app secret. So in that process I talked about a minute ago, and we're going to look at it in more depth on the next slide, where the application receives a code and then goes back to Azure AD and says, hey, here's a code, I need an access token. When it does that, the application has to, I'm going to put it in air quotes, log in to Azure AD. And the way we do that on, like, say, a web-based application or on a service is that the application has its own credentials, a client ID and a client secret. Think of it like a username and password, but just for the app. Well, we can't do that same process on a native app because we're going to be building some code, building our application, and then distributing that code to many, many users' mobile devices. And once that code's been distributed, well, if that code has a secret in it, then we've kind of compromised ourselves a little bit. And so with a native app, it works a little bit different. In a native app, we don't use an app secret. Instead, we only provide in a client ID. And then we have a special redirection URL that will be used for by Azure AD that will hand back to the client application so that it knows that the authentication model is a little more secure and it's a little more tight. It's just not it doesn't use the client ID and secret that a web application can do because it can protect that model. Now, let's look at the flow here and get a better understanding of how this whole thing works. So we've got 4 different pieces here that I want you to take note of here. So in the bottom left corner, that's the user. I'm just going to say that's me. And in the top left corner, you've got something called the OAuth client. That's our native application that we're going to build on the mobile device. In the top right corner, you've got the resource server. That's where the API is, or in our case, that's where the Microsoft Graph is. And then finally, you've got the authorization server. And again, in this scenario, that's Azure AD. So everything starts in the bottom left corner where the user opens up the application on their mobile device and they want to go look at, say, some calendar items in their calendar using the Microsoft Graph. What the application is going to do is it's going to realize that the user is not logged in. And so what it does is it will then take the user, it'll open up a browser on the mobile device, and it will send the user to the authentication URL or authorization URL at Azure AD. So our resource owner in the bottom left corner is then going to log in to Azure AD. That's that line going across the bottom of the slide there. It says grant access. The authorization server is going to prompt the user for their credentials. They're going to log in with their username and password. Keep note, though, that the user is not providing their credentials to the application, it's providing it to Azure AD that we trust. If the user has not already granted the mobile application specific permissions to the Microsoft Graph, then Azure AD is going to prompt the user to grant it those permissions. And that's the common consent framework. That's where it's going to say, this application needs access to this permission, this permission, this permission. Do you accept those permissions? And then you say yes or accept. The authorization server is then going to hand back the resource owner a code, an authorization code. And the user is then going to, inside the mobile client, that's going to then go from the browser login back over to the client, the application. There's a certain amount of code that we're going to have to write to make this work. And the application then, in the top left corner, will be able to take that authorization code and then go log into Azure AD and provide it this code and say, I need an access token for this user. Azure AD is going to look at that code and say, I can tell that this is a code that I created, I being Azure AD, because it was digitally signed by Azure AD with their private key. So they know that the contents of the code are valid because it has a digital signature that matches one that only Azure AD could have signed. So it trusts that service. So it will then take that code. It knows that in that code it says things like it was the user was me. They're trying to access the Microsoft Graph, and that it's coming from this application, this native app. So Azure AD will look inside of his database and say, has this user granted this application permissions to the Microsoft Graph? And the answer is yes, because that's what we just did. It will then create an OAuth access token, and it will hand that back in that diagonal line going from the bottom left to the top right that says issue token. It will send that over to back to the native application. And that access token will contain the user. It will contain the resource that the token is valid for, in our case, the Microsoft Graph. And it will contain all of the scopes or permissions that the user granted the application. And now, from the top left corner, the native app can then request make an access data request over to the Microsoft Graph. That's the horizontal line across the top, going from left to right to the resource server, the Microsoft Graph. The Microsoft Graph will get that token, it will look at the token, and it will say, is this token valid? It knows it's valid because it's going to look at the digital signature, and it knows that it's going to be able to match the digital signature against the public key that Azure AD uses, because the only thing that's going to match is the private key that Azure AD uses. So Microsoft Graph can say, I trust that this access token was created by Azure AD, and the application's giving it to me. It's then going to open up that access token and know that I can see that this is a request for this specific user. This access token is intended for the Microsoft Graph, and it has these permissions. So it will then access the data that's being requested and then hand that back to our native OAuth client, our native application. And that's how the whole authentication dance and authentication flow is going to work here. You notice here that both the client and the resource server need to know about the authorization server, which in our case is Azure AD. Let me talk a little bit about different endpoint versions that we have in Azure AD. We have a V1 endpoint and a V2 endpoint. V1 came first, obviously. V2 came second. Now, how did this work? Well, in the V1 endpoint, there was two characteristics to it that are worth noting here, and why we don't use it in a scenario for the Microsoft Graph anymore. One of the scenarios is that Azure AD only supported, in the V1 endpoint, only supported the Azure Active Directory authentication. It did not support any other styles of authentication. And so what that meant is that if the user was logging in with a personal account or consumer account, also known as a Microsoft account, and they wanted to access things like their OneDrive consumer account or their Outlook.com account, things like that, our application would have to know what kind of account they were signing in with, and we would have to send them to a whole different authentication model. So that's one downside, because Azure AD or the V1 endpoint only supported work and school accounts or accounts with that leveraged Azure AD. The other challenge that we had is that with a V1 endpoint, it required what's called static consent, which meant that every single permission that our application was going to need when the user first logged in, they were going to have to grant all the permissions up front at that time. They had to declare everything at the very first time. But what that's going to allow us to do then is that we don't have to worry about that extra complexity. We're going to let Azure AD figure all that out for us. So that's one nice thing. That's the first 2 points. Converged authentication accepts sign-in for both Microsoft personal accounts and Azure AD Work and School, and it enables the same code, the code that we write, for using the Microsoft Graph for things like reading mail and retrieving contacts. Now, the next thing that's really important here is the dynamic consent. And what's nice about this differs from V1, where we had static consent, where now every time you go to request a access token from Azure AD, you specify the permissions that you need for that access token. Now, let's say, for example, in the example I gave a minute ago, when the user went to log in, they had to grant all permissions that this application could possibly need up front. Well, now, when the user signs in, all I really need to do is I just need to request the user impersonation scope, and that's going to allow me to get information about the current user, just get their name, their email address, etc. And now they get a much better experience when they log into my app. Maybe they're only going to use the capability to reorganize their email into different folders. When they go to do that, I can request another access token that says I need mail.read and mail.write. And when I do that, then the user is only going to be prompted for those permissions if they had not already granted those permissions to the app. The next time they go to use the app, same thing. It's going to go check to see we need these permissions. Azure AD says I can tell this user has already granted those permissions, so we don't need to go through that whole process a second time. But we don't have to request permissions for their calendar, for their tasks, or for their files in OneDrive. We only need to ask for that stuff when they actually need it. So I think that's a better experience because your users aren't hit with a lot of stuff. And you've seen a similar model with this, like on your mobile devices. An application may, like if you were going to use one of these social apps and you wanted to post something to this social network, let's say you just want to post some text. Well, it doesn't need a permission for that. But then if you wanted to, say, post a picture that you had taken, they need access to your photos on your phone. And so it prompts you for, do you grant this application access to your photos? Yes or no. The next thing is maybe I want to take a picture and have it send right away. So then it's going to ask for permissions to your camera. Or you want to do a little video. So now it wants permissions to your camera and your microphone. If you had installed the app and the first time you went to log in, it says, I need access to your microphone and your camera and your photos, you may be a bit turned off by the app and say, I don't want to give you all those permissions. I just want to post some text to this social network. That's what dynamic consent is all about. It allows you to incrementally just grant these permissions. And you can learn more about the V2 endpoint if you go to aka.ms/aadv2. Now let me talk about some of the other improvements from the V1 endpoint to the V2 endpoint. In the V1 endpoint, you had to provide a resource parameter to identify which resources you were requesting an access token for. And the challenge with this is that some of the open source libraries were not able to easily incorporate that into their requests. So now we use the scope parameter, which is supported by all the libraries to compound and combine both the resource and the permission. When you build applications with Azure AD V1, you also had to register all the permissions the application needed. That was called static consent. We just went through that a minute ago. The user had to consent to all of those things statically, but with V2, we can now send scopes that you want at the time you want them. We don't have to ask for them all up front. That's the dynamic consent. We're also going to change the contents of the ID token. This is the token that is going to be included with the response for the login that contains information about the current user, like their email address and their name, etc. And this is going to better conform to the OpenID Connect V1 specification. For example, we're using things like preferred username claim instead of a claim called UPN. And also in the past, if you needed a client application or a single page application or a web app or a web API or a daemon service, we had to create multiple Azure AD registrations and wire up each of the relationships between each one of those. And it was a bit of a pain. But now in the V2, this now is going to enable us just one app registration across a single logical application. And we can then open up all the different areas that we support for the different applications, such as representing a native and a web application if we wanted to. For more information, you can use that link at the bottom of the slide to learn more about the V1 versus V2 key improvements. Now let me talk a little bit about working with the different SDKs when it comes to Azure AD. Now the nice thing about this is that you really are going to self-select yourself into which one you're going to use. If you're using the V1 authentication endpoint, you have to use the Azure Active Directory Authentication Library, or ADAL. It only works with V1. If you're going to be using the V2 endpoint with the dynamic consent and some of the other things we've talked about, which is the recommendation from the Microsoft Graph team, you're going to be using the Microsoft Authentication Library. This targets the V2 endpoint. It's got a new conceptual model of two different kinds of applications. One's called a public client app and one's called a confidential client app. A confidential client is one that has runs in a web experience where you can put both the client ID and the secret in the application. Where a public client application is one going to be more like a native app, where I'm not going to be able to provide the secret. I'm only going to be providing the client ID. We also have a couple different platforms on where this is supported. There's MSAL.net for .NET Client, Windows Store, ASP or .NET Core, Android, iOS, Xamarin, Universal Windows platform. There's a JavaScript implementation, an Objective-C implementation for iOS and macOS, and an Android implementation as well. Now, where are we going to register our applications? This has changed a little bit over the years, but now where we would recommend that you go is to go to the Azure AD admin portal. That's at aad.portal.azure.com. Now, there's a bunch of advantages to using this. First advantage here is that you don't need to have a Azure subscription to get to the Azure AD admin portal. You can log in with either a Microsoft account or an Azure AD account. And you'll see in the demo, when we log into this, it looks like the Azure portal, except the options of all the different Azure resources that are available to us are all gone except for Azure AD. This new admin portal is also going to allow you to create and manage both V1 and V2 style Azure AD applications. So you can have access to both the V1 and the V2 authorization endpoints. You're also going to be able to leverage either ADAL or MSAL for authentication. And again, as I said in the last slide, that really is going to be dictated based on what you end up doing with using either the V1 or the V2 endpoint. But because we're dealing with a Microsoft Graph, as I said before, you really are going to want to focus on using the V2 endpoint. So what does it look like? Well, you're going to go to the Azure AD admin portal and you're going to create a new application. So here I give it a name and then I specify what account types are available to me. So I could say that I want to use, this is where you're really going to pick, are you going to support work and school accounts in Azure AD or Microsoft accounts? And the first two choices that you see there with accounts in the organization directory only or organizations in any organization directory, that basically is saying, is it multi-tenant or single tenant? The first option is saying single tenant, meaning only people inside of my Azure AD or inside of my organization can use this app. The second one is multi-tenant, saying the app's going to be registered in my Azure AD, but anybody can use it that has Azure AD. And then the last one is saying really anybody, both anybody in any Azure AD and anybody with a personal account, a Microsoft account or an MSA, such as a Skype account, an Xbox account, or an Outlook.com account. Once you've done that, your application's been created and you're going to have an application ID. So you're going to grab that ID and copy that down. And then you're going to have these redirect URIs. And this basically is going to say, once someone logs in, where should they be sent or what valid places can they be sent? And at the top, you see that there's a web option. And that's where if I was building a website, where would I redirect them to after they signed in? But that doesn't work on a mobile experience or on a native experience like on the desktop. And so instead, we're going to choose this first option here, which is using MSAL, which basically is going to have a special kind of a code that includes the ID of the application that the native SDKs are going to understand how to work with. Now let's talk a little bit about implementing Azure AD authentication for Android-based apps. The Azure AD team is going to provide an Android SDK for native Android applications. What you're going to do is you're going to add this to your project using the Gradle tool that I talked about earlier. Again, Gradle is a tool for build and package management that is commonly used in Android development, and is very similar to MS Build and NuGet that we're familiar with in the .NET world. You're also going to want to add in a reference to something called Volley. Volley is a Android-based package library that is used for HTTP networking as well. So you can see I have these listed here. The version numbers may be different based on what you're doing and where you are when you're watching this video, as the Microsoft Authentication Library is relatively new in terms of being generally available as of mid-2019. And so you may see new versions of this that are available, and you may not be using the version that you see listed here. All right, let's see a demo. Now, in this demo, we're going to create an application using the Azure AD admin portal. And then I'm going to show you what we've done to our Android application since the last demo to add in the Microsoft Authentication Library, and then some of the configuration changes that we have to do in order to make our application work with Azure AD. So let's go ahead and dive into the demo. All right, the first step that we're going to need to integrate the Microsoft Authentication Library in our application is I'm going to start by going to the Azure Active Directory Admin Center and creating a new application in Azure AD that we can use as our app. So what I'm going to do first, I've gone ahead and gone to the Azure AD admin portal that you see listed here, and I've gone ahead and logged in. So now I'm going to go over here to the app registrations and create a brand new app. So I'm going to go to app registrations, and I'm going to select new registration, and I'm going to go ahead and give this a name. So we'll just call this our native O365 calendar events. And when I do that, I'm going to say I'm going to allow any organization to use it. So I could use my Microsoft account, I could use my my Azure Active Directory account, and anybody else could use it as well inside of their applications as well. So I go through and I'll then select register here, or if you see down here at the bottom the URI, I'm going to leave that blank. And you'll see because we're not doing anything with a web-based application. So I go ahead and do this, and I'm going to need to create a copy of this GUID here. So I'm going to go ahead and copy this and paste it down on a little scratch pad off to the side. Now that I've done that, let's go over here and let's add in a redirect URI. So I'm going to select add a redirect URI, and I'm going to choose this MSAL option right here. So this has the entire string of my ID of my my application. I'm going to go ahead and select that one, and then I'm going to go ahead and hit save. Now, while it's doing that, I'm actually going to copy this to the clipboard as well, because I'm going to need this in a later step. Now, let's go through and now that we've set this up, we're pretty much good to go for our application. Now that we've got our application all set up, the next thing we're going to need to do is then go modify the actual code. So let's switch over to the code. Okay, so let's see what we've done with our application to add in the Microsoft Authentication Library support. So I go over here to my build Gradle, and what you'll see is I've added in a couple options. Now, we see the Graph SDK here. We're going to deal with that in the next demo, but what you'll notice here is I've added in an implementation here for the Microsoft Authentication Library. Now, what I've also done is over here under Resources and Values, I have an OAuth strings section. And so this section right here is where I'm going to define things like the permissions that my application is going to need, as well as the ID of my app inside of Azure AD. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab the GUID of what we just created a minute ago, and I'm going to go ahead and paste that in like so. I'm also going to include here where I have this, where it asks for the redirect URI. Now, if you recall from what we actually created a couple minutes ago when we created our redirect URI and I copied it in, there's something you really want to pay attention here, because the MSAL Android SDK has got an interesting kind of little way of dealing with this, and this is something you could run into. So if I go back to the browser, notice here that this is what my string looks like here for my redirect URI. And notice it starts with MSAL, and then there's the long GUID, and then it finishes with :// auth. And it says you're going to use this for MSAL. But if you look at the code for my project, you'll notice here that it just says your app ID here. And notice MSAL is at the front, and then the : //auth at the very end is missing. Well, now in the lab, what I tell you to do is I tell you to make sure that you don't include that auth on the end of it. So I'm really just going to go through and put the ID of my app right here with the MSAL prefix, but I'm going to leave off the auth on the very end. Now, the reason I'm doing that is because the Microsoft Authentication Library is already going to do that stuff for me. So I don't need to worry about that. Now, that's all the integration stuff I've done, but now we got to go modify some code changes and some permissions inside the app. So the first step is to go tell our Android application what permissions it needs. And so here you see inside of the Android manifest.xml file, I've defined a couple permissions here. I've defined that we need access to the internet and access to the network state. That's just for our native application that we created. So that's just to make sure that I'm pulling those things in correctly. Now, the next thing that we're going to need to do is inside of the application element, I'm also going to set up this browser activity that you see here. And notice here, this browser tab activity, what that's doing is that's going to allow the MSAL authentication library to open up a browser and send the user to Azure AD to go log in. And here you see down here the data piece. See where it says auth at the very end? That's why I left it off of the redirect URI just a few minutes ago. And then here's the scheme that it's using. That's being pulled from that redirect URI. So it was just showing me a preview of what it was showing, but it was pulling it from that other string that you see right there. Now, the next thing we're going to probably want to do is to implement some sort of an authentication helper to make my life a little bit easier. So here I've created an authentication helper, and this code is what it's really doing here. As you can see, this is a string that's being replaced. If I select it, that's pulling it from that resource, the app ID, and all of our scopes that we defined as well. Things like the user.read and calendar events read. So all this library is really doing is it's going through and it's going to generate, take the current context, which is the main activity, and it's going to go through and get some values from the public, from the settings that we had defined. Now I'm creating a new instance of the public client application. That is coming from the Microsoft Identity Library, the MSAL. And remember, this public client application that I talked about earlier, this thing is it's not going to use a secret. It's only going to be using an ID because this code is distributed down to the user's devices, and we can't put the code in there as well at the same time. The lab has you go through and walk and add all this other stuff like handling the redirect, acquiring the token interactively, acquiring a token silently, and then also signing out. So this is all really boilerplate stuff. But what we need to do now is we need to leverage this inside of our application. So I'm going to come back over here to my main activity. And inside of my main activity, I've added in a bunch of import statements related to what we just looked at. So things like here, some Android stuff and utilities, but then also all of the authentication, the MSAL stuff that we needed. I've added in a reference to our authentication helper class that we had created. And then I'm also went into the onCreate method. And what I did is I modified it so that inside of this, I'm saying right down here is I'm getting a reference to the authentication helper. And so what that's doing is it's saying get instance, getting our current application context and giving us a reference to our authentication handler here. Now, the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to also implement this thing called the activity result. And what this is going to do is that this is what's triggering or what's going to be called when the browser, after the user's gone and logged in with Azure AD in the browser, and control is returned back to my native application. So it's going to go through and it's going to grab some information here like the code, the request code, the result code, and the data. And I'm simply going to pass that into the handle redirect of our auth helper. Then I'm going to go through and also implement a bunch of code that we have. Let me scroll down here, where we can handle all of the sign-in capabilities here. So there we go. So here is, there we go, do sign-in. So do a silent sign-in. That's going to be defined here by calling the acquire token silently. And then we also have an interactive sign-in, which is going to be calling the auth helper and doing our interactive sign-in. That's passing in the current activity that we're in, our main activity, and the authentication callback. Here's our callback once the user, or where's our callback? It's farther, here we go. Here's our authentication callback, where I need to override a couple different methods. of the object that's being passed back, a success method, an error method, and a cancel method as well. Notice here in our success method, we've already got some stuff set up for the graph helper, and this is kind of jumping the gun a bit. You'll see where we'll look more into this, how this works once we do the following section. We look at in the last demo and we see when we're actually integrating some graph stuff here. But really in this case, all we're really doing here is we are using this to go get who the current user is. So here, getting the user, passing in an access token and a user callback, the get user callback, that is right here where I'm getting their display name and their email address of the currently logged in user. Now, what happens when I click that sign on button, or we had that in our navigation? So here under sign in, I'm going to turn on the progress bar. I'm going to check and see if they have an account, and if they do have an account, meaning we know that they've already logged in, then I can do a silent sign in, which means that, hey, I may already have a token. Otherwise, I need to do an interactive sign in. Sign out just does the exact opposite. So let's now test this application and see if this works. So let's go ahead and let's run our application. So I'm going to come over here and click on run and fire up the emulator. So we'll pull the emulator over. All right, so here's our application. So I'll come over here and I will select sign in. And so now I'm going to go ahead and sign in with the account that I've already used before. So I'll go ahead and select this account. And here we can see that I've never used, I've never given this application access to our application, to my account inside of Office 365. So it's prompting me. It says, here's the application, the native O365 calendar events. It wants these scopes. So there's the impersonation one, signing in as us, and giving it access to my calendar. So I'll go ahead and say, I will allow it to do that, and then say accept. So now I've granted it access, I'm logging in, and there's my account name, my MOD administrator, and then there's the account that I've signed in as. So here you can see the authentication is working, I'm logging in successfully, and I am going ahead and signing in and seeing some information about the user. So the next step in this application is going to be to add in the support for the Microsoft Graph, and we'll see how to do that in the next section. In this section, we're going to look at building native apps with the Microsoft Graph Java SDK. And specifically, we're going to look at integrating the Java SDK for the Microsoft Graph into our native Android application. We're going to look at the Microsoft Graph Java SDK, something called the Graph Service Client, and then how we can go about making requests. Developers can leverage the Microsoft Graph REST API in any kind of an application. All it requires is a standard HTTP request. You can check out the Android HTTP library Volley for those use cases. But Microsoft also provides a native Android SDK for the Microsoft Graph. This abstracts away the details of working with a REST API. The SDK provides a fluent API for creating these different requests. So here you can see that after I've created an instance of my Graph client, I can then just use the fluent API. For example, I could say .me to get to my information, and then go .events to get to my calendar, and then I can build a request. And that request I'm passing in is an array. That array is going to contain a bunch of parameters that I put on the URL, like $select, $top, and $skip. And these are all OData based parameters. And what they're allowing me to do is specify only the specific fields I'm interested in with the select parameter. The $top is going to say I only want the first 20 items to come back. And the $skip is saying how many elements do I want to skip in the result. So if I was on, like, say, page 2, I may want to skip the first 40. In this case here, I'm on page 1. Then to execute the request, I'm going to call .get and pass in a callback to get the results of this request. Now, how do I go about integrating the Microsoft Graph into a native Android application? Now, just like the Azure AD MSAL Android SDK, the Graph team provides a Java SDK for native Android applications. You're going to add this to your project using Gradle. Again, Gradle is a tool that is a build and package management utility that is commonly used in Android development, very similar in the .NET world to MS Build and NuGet. You're also going to want to add in a reference to something called JSON, which is an open source library that is going to help you with serialization and deserialization of Java and JSON objects. kind of like that Newtonsoft library that we use for JSON.NET in the .NET world. Now, one thing to note here is that depending on the size of your application, you may need to enable something called ProGuard and multidexing on your project. This is due to the fact that the Java SDK for the Microsoft Graph uses a large number of classes to describe all of the different functionality. If you check the documentation for the Java SDK for the Microsoft Graph, it'll walk you through how to set this up on your project. So it's not something you're going to have to spend too much time trying to figure out. Now, most applications are only going to need a single instance of the Microsoft Graph Service Client for calling the Microsoft Graph. So to simplify this process, consider creating a singleton to manage this process. And so here you can see that in this Java snippet that you see here. Note that you're going to need to override the requests that are being sent, and you're going to need to add the access token to the request. And you can do that by overriding the method authenticate request. That is on the authentication provider interface. So you can see at the top, I'm implementing the authentication provider interface, and I'm overriding the authenticate request by adding in the access token. And then I'm just going to use the Microsoft Graph Java SDK. So here I've got two methods, get user and get events. I'm going to call the graph with a graph service client object. This call is very straightforward. It looks very much like the code snippet I showed you earlier. I'm going to use the Fluent API to build up a request. You can see that for the events, actually almost the exact same one that we saw in the slides a few minutes ago on the last line of code there. The build request method, as I showed you, is going to allow you to add options to the OData query that's going to be sent to the REST API. So you can see there I'm using the order by operation in this case. All right, let's check out a demo and let's see this in action. So in this last demo that we're going to look at inside this module, this is going to show you how to add in the Microsoft Graph Java SDK to your Android application, and then the code that's going to be required to make calls to the Microsoft Graph. And then we're going to see our application running. So let's go ahead and dive into our demo. All right, in this last demo, we're going to see how we can modify the application, or how we have modified it, to take advantage of the Microsoft Authentication Library and the Graph SDK to be able to leverage data inside of Office 365 for my user. Before I do that, let me double check on the auth strings and let me set the values again. All right, so what I have here is I have a class that I've created called the Graph Helper. And what the Graph Helper has is I've got a bunch of import statements of things I'm pulling in from the graph. If you recall, before we go too far, in the last demo, I showed you how we added in this Microsoft Graph SDK for Java. So I'm using the 1.4.0 version of the Graph SDK. So if I come over here and look at my helper, I've got a bunch of import statements that I've set up here for things related to the graph that I'm taking advantage of. And then inside this Graph Helper, I'll scroll down a little bit, I have a method here called getEvents. And what getEvents is doing is it's taking in a token and it's got a callback defined, and I'm simply going and creating in a, using the Fluent API that Microsoft provides us to go get all of the events. So see here I'm going, looking at the client, going to the me endpoint, the events endpoint, and then building a request, sorting things on a specific dates, getting only specific fields back, and then once I do the get method, I'm then going to implement the callback. So where is this being used? Well, if I come over here to my calendar fragment that I have defined, over here in my calendar fragment, I had to go in and add in a bunch of import statements here, right here, that are all going to be using the Microsoft Graph and some stuff with the authentication library as well. I've got two members that I've added here, one for a list of events and then one for a progress bar to show going and fetching the data. And then here's what I've done. On here on the progress bar, for showing the progress bar, I'm going to look at the current activity, and I'm on the current thread. I'm going to set the visibility of my progress bar to visible, and hide does the exact opposite. It sets his visibility equal to gone. Now what happens when I fetch some data? Well, I'm going to use the getEvents callback. So what that does is on a successful callback, I'm going to get a bunch of events back. I'm going to get the current page of all the events, and then I'm going to add them to a list. All right. So once I do that, once I've fetched all the events, I'm then going to hide the progress bar, and I've added in this events list. So once that happens, if I scroll down a little bit here, when the onCreate method is going to run, what this is going to do is this is going to be getting the information about the progress bar, getting an instance of the authentication helper, and trying to go fetch the token. So when this whole calendar fragment is created, that's when you see it's going to go fetch the token. Now, a minute ago, I said that once we had a successful callback to going and fetching the events, we called the event or the method adding events to the list. Well, I scroll down here, I look at what that method does, add events to the list. He simply gets a reference to the list view for our events list, and then it creates an adapter, and then it goes through and sets for the view. I set the adapter equal to the adapter that is listed right here. So let's go ahead and let's actually run this application. Now, one thing you're going to notice is that on a success, we should see all of our events get logged out here to the log. So let's go ahead and let's run our application. So I'm going to go ahead and click the play button and fire up our emulator again. We'll give it a second to go through and install everything and get it running. All right, so let's go ahead and sign in. So I'm going to go over here. I'm going to sign in. We're going to use the same account we used before. Except notice this time I don't get prompted for the consent to grant any permissions because I did that on the last step. I don't have to go request those things again. So I'm going to come over here, and then I'm going to go through and go to my calendar fragment. So this should fetch a bunch of calendar items from my calendar. And so here you can see a bunch of calendar items showing up for my calendar. And I can even come back over here to the log cat right here. And if I open this up, I should be able to find a place where all of my data is coming back from the Microsoft Graph. So it just takes a second to find where all that JSON data is. Here's our access token that we were writing out. So we were writing out the access token from our authentication helper. And that means our data is probably going to be soon after that. Here we go, dgraph. So there we go. Now we can see all of our data. So you can see all the data coming back as a JSON array. And all this data that came back to us, well, you can take a look at it by if I come back over here after the calendar fragment, if I look at the actual layout of that fragment, here you can see I've got my list view. I have the events list coming back. And for each one of these different items that are coming back, I have an event list item. So you can see I have an event list. Here's my event list item that I've defined, where I've got a couple text views, a linear layout, and this is all going to be all rendering it out how I'm getting these different renderings here of my calendar items to display on the application. This fragment does have this events list and list item. This does have a code behind associated with it. Here's our adapter that you see right here. And what this is doing, this is what's fetching all the data from the object it's being bound to. And I'm going through and binding all of that data to the different elements that I had inside of the XML representation of my of the fragment. And then I'm also going through and localizing the any dates to the current time for the local settings for my application. So if I'm like say in the US East Coast, then I want to localize it to the current date and time zone where I currently am for local stuff. And that's basically it. That's how you've seen now how to go build what an Azure app, what a Android native application looks like, and how to add in the Microsoft authentication library to it to do authentication and log in. And then you also saw how to integrate the Microsoft Graph Java SDK to be able to go fetch calendar items from a calendar and display those in my application as well. Now we've reached the end of this screencast for this module. You've seen a lot about how to do development with the Microsoft Graph based on the topic that we've covered here. Keep in mind that everything you saw here inside the screencast accompanies a training module where you can find slides and hands-on labs and all the final solutions that we showed you in the demos inside this screencast. So if you want to learn more, I'd recommend you check out the module associated with this screencast. Again, if you remember, the demonstrations that we showed you in this screencast, they don't walk you through every single step of building the application. Rather, we just look at the final solution that we've built and we see it running, which you can expect to see. If you want to see how to go about building a solution just like this, go look at the hands-on lab exercise that accompanies this module, because each of the demos corresponds with a specific exercise from the hands-on lab. So we have steps where you can walk through each one of these things. Again, one of the reasons we don't do all of the individual steps in the screencast is because things change on a very rapid cadence in this new cloud world, and different dependencies change, version numbers change, maybe a couple steps in screen caps are going to change as well in the hands-on lab. And so we keep the hands-on labs updated every couple months. But the videos would get out of date really quick if we tried to do that. So to save a little bit of time, we've just showed you the final solution, and we maintain the hands-on labs that you can take advantage of. I hope you got a lot out of this. There are a lot of other training modules associated with the Microsoft Graph that I'd recommend that you definitely take a look at. We've also got a couple additional links here that are at the end of the slides in the training module where you could use to learn more about this technology. So again, hope you got a lot out of this and you enjoyed this screencast. Thank you very much for taking the time to watch it.